you're just joining us, we're discussing the subject of grief tonight. We have an author with us, Janet Haney. Janet is a local writer and author of a book titled Hello, Nobody. Subtitle is Standing at the Door Alone, What Do You Do When Everything Changes? Welcome, Janet.
Hi, Karen. Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me on the show tonight.
Sure, we're happy to have you tonight. So what I have here is your book, Hello, Nobody, and I also have that you are a certified journal facilitator, a transition writing specialist, author, teacher, and now, I forgot when we met earlier, at your church, you're now the director of grief. So anyway, I wanted to have you on the show to discuss your book and how you've walked through your grief. And everyone, of course, if we're human, we all have some kind of situation that will require true grit and big faith and patience to persevere to a positive end. And in reading your book, you tell a story and how you came to that end. So are you able to share just a bit about your story and what prompted you to write the book?
Well, first of all, I wrote my story. I wrote my book because it was my story, and I felt like I needed to share it. And I will just say that, grief is everywhere. It's in our neighborhoods. It's in our churches. I feel like it's everywhere. And I really enjoyed the quote that you read in the beginning. And I have a quote in the beginning of my book. And it says, your heartache is someone else's hope. If you make it through, someone else will make it through. Tell your story. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where my book is coming from, to tell my story. It feels like grief fills us up sometimes to overflowing, and it needs a place to be poured out. And my book happened to be how I poured out some of my grief. I mean, everybody does have a story, and my story started, my son was 9. We went to wake him up for school one day, and he had died in his sleep. And a couple years later, my husband discovered that he had prostate cancer, and that was a long battle that he lost. My daughter moved away to other states to get on with her life, so I found myself in an empty nest. And then I had a battle with breast cancer myself. And so when you're hit in the stomach like that, and I know a lot of people are, with grief after grief after grief, your grief coping tank doesn't even have time to get filled up. You're hit with your next grief problem.
Sure.
And so my book really was a pouring out of my story, because I felt like it's a journey. Everyone is on their journey, and here's what I did, and here's how I got through it. So
your title, Hello, Nobody, when you talked about your son gone, your husband, your daughter moved away, and so you walk in the door at night and you said, hello, nobody. And so that was an inspiration to bring about the story to tell others. It's a great title.
Thanks, yeah. It hit me. I owned a store, a little knitting shop. I walked into my house one day, put my stuff down, and I remember saying out loud to my house, hello, nobody. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that's the title of my book. And so it rolled around in my head for a long time. And actually how I started writing my book was I was visiting my daughter. She lived in Colorado. Got there, it was in February, got there on a sunny, breezy day. Next day, a blizzard blew in, and we were snowbound for 3 days. And I thought, I'm going to start my book.
Mm-hmm. Providential.
Yeah. So I got 2 grocery bags, taped them together, taped them on the floor, wrote in the middle of the bags of the paper, hello, nobody, because I knew that was going to be my title. And probably you don't write a book starting from the title, but that's how I did mine. Then I just did a brain dump. Everything that hello, nobody meant to me, stories, circumstances, situations, points of view, whatever. I just wrote them on that paper, filled it all up, put little bubbles around them. Then I got a piece of paper and I looked at all the writing on the floor, and I started making my outline and subheadings.
I like how you started your book. Janet is a twin, and she starts that she was always with someone her whole life. And so Hello Nobody is something different for her, being a twin, and that's a really great story. And by the way, we have another guest in the studio tonight. We want to say hello to Kathy. She's here. This is Janet's sister. She's in from California, so we have a little audience with us tonight. So hello, Kathy. And but back to your brother, that's a terrific way that you start your book, with having always been with someone, and so this was profound for you be alone.
It really was. And my sister, who was visiting in the studio today, we even had a double wedding. We married brothers, so I didn't even get married by myself.
Yeah.
And here, all of a sudden, I'm by myself. I'm living alone. My family is all gone. It's just, how do you cope with that? And that's, how do you reinvent yourself? How do you do that? And I tell a little story in the book about even when I was 7, I was excited to go to sleepover camp. Yippee. Got there and didn't realize that my brother was going to be in the boys' camp across the lake, and I spent the whole week crying about missing my brother.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the counselor thought I was missing my parents, but I was missing my brother.
Your other half.
Yeah.
So
a
a lot of your book talks about faith.
Yeah, what does I really enjoyed reading your book. To say I enjoyed reading it, it's a hard thing to say because it's such a heavy. The circumstances are heavy, and the whole process of grief is heavy. But you have such a winsome way of describing how you worked through those various stages. What role did your faith play in all of that?
Well, I think for me, and probably for a lot of people, hard trials actually uncover your faith. I was brought up in a Christian home. I had Christian parents, went to church, went to Sunday school, even went to a Christian college for a while. I mean, that was my culture. But really, until you have these struggles in life, really that makes you decide, okay, is my faith real? Is it something I can really stand on? Is it something that really is a framework of my life? Can I trust that I don't get this? I don't know why this happened to me. I don't even want this to happen to me. I don't want my life to be like this. But it will be used as a purpose for me and for other people. God doesn't waste anything.
Right. And I think you did ask why. You talked about that in your book. And I think a lot of people get stuck on the why. And that's a hard thing to get through, like you're talking about, to say, is this a real faith? Am I really going to be steadfast in the face of something I don't understand? And I'm asking why, and I'm not even getting an answer.
There are lots of times, too, that we think that it's somehow inappropriate to ask why.
Right.
And yet, you read in the scriptures, the people in the Bible were asking God why all the time.
Right.
I mean, they were submitting to his control, his leadership, but they were still asking why. And he's not, we don't demand that he gives us answers, but at least he allows us the conversation, and it's helpful.
Dave, I don't think he minds that we ask why.
No,
because
I think
he wants us to be real. And that's the only way we can really get to our authentic self of who God really made us to be, is if we're honest.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right.
When our life is smoldering and we're walking over the coals, God wants he wants to hear about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There's some brutal honesty from the people in the pages of the Bible, and I think we can learn from that. Sadly, I think we talked about depression and grief earlier, and we have an inordinately depressed society now.
Right.
Lots of people dealing with depression, and you wonder how much of that is tied to grief and tied to the unexpressed things that are going on inside of us because of grief and loss.
Well, I find that is quite a bit, and why I even wrote the curriculum for our grieving group and the workshops, because I think we all carry things from our childhood and on, and they don't get resolved, and therefore need an expression.
Yeah.
So, all right, well, we need to take a break, and if you'd like to share in the conversation or ask Janet a question, it's 513-749-5500. We'll be right back. You're listening to 55 KRC. We're back. We're discussing a book titled Hello Nobody with author Janet Haney. And Janet, in your book, you used a great visual, and I hope you don't mind. I'd like to just read a couple sentences out of your book. And this is out of the chapter titled Change Brings the Unfamiliar. And you say, I protect myself with a large comfort zone. I wear mine like a rubber tube around my waist. I manage very well, encased safely in the middle of what I know and understand. When I'm pushed to the outer rings of this safety zone, I feel unsettled and anxious. The familiar makes me feel safe and secure. And I would assume that most people feel that way about our settled lives. And when things go topsy-turvy during grief, I'm curious about, this is such a great visual, and I think, like in our piano keyboard, we can get stuck somewhere, and sometimes people isolate. And I wonder how that went for you.
Well, I definitely think when something hurtful, a struggle happens, your heart is broken, the natural thing to do really is to pull back, to kind of isolate yourself. That's what I did anyway. And really any kind of grief that can happen, you can feel isolated in heartbreak, if you have a divorce, if you've lost your job, if you've got cancer or any kind of illness, you've been in an accident, you have an empty nest, your dreams are lost. I mean, there's such a long list of grief. People think lots of times that it's only someone dying, and it's really not. So grief, like I said before, is all around us, and it's very easy to pull back, isolate yourself, pull away from your world and what you know, because it's changed, it's gone, it's different.
And there's something good about that, I think, that we need to go inward and kind of lick our wounds and heal a bit. Yet at the same time, your future chapters talk about how, that was possibly not a positive thing.
But for a time only. I think you can isolate yourself for too long, and then that's not healthy, because the only way to get through grief is to go through it. You can't go around it. You have to go through it. And you can sit in your isolation and think that you're handling it, but at some point you're going to have to look at it and say, okay, and go through it. And I always like to also think of grief as a tunnel, that it's dark in the middle. You don't know where you're going maybe, but there is an end. The tunnel has another end to it, and so you've got to get through it. And that's what it means to me. It's a way also, I think isolating yourself is a way of protecting yourself. Sure. And I think a lot of people do that. And I think that's kind of normal. I think God gives us that, because I know, especially with my little boy dying, that was such a big grief. I really could only handle little pieces of it at a time. It was too big. So it takes a long time.
Yes.
And no one can really tell you how long grief needs to be.
Right.
Because it's whatever it needs to be for you.
Sure. And did you have family, friends, anyone rally around to help you come out of that intertube stage that you talk about?
I did. I owned a yarn shop at the time. I had it. I had the shop when George was sick, and then when he was dying, my shop was just a place, a community for me to that rallied around me. And then after he died, it was really a soft place for me to land, for me to come back, because my customers, my staff, it was something familiar.
Yes.
It was a familiar thing that I could have in my life. That was really important for me, and family and friends. The thing is, nobody knows your grief except you. They can come alongside, but only you know what it feels like for you. In fact, I've heard it said that grief is like falling in love. You don't know what it is until it happens to you, but once you've experienced it, you know it, and you can't explain it. And so I think when struggles and grief come on you, God really can use that to plow up in you the ability to come alongside someone else, and you can look in their eyes and you can see the grief in them because it's in you. You know what it feels like. And so I think we can really, that's the way we can help each other, is by being honest and, like I said, tell your story. Yes. Don't be afraid to tell your story.
I want to ask you about that community, that the people that surrounded you during that time. A lot of times we feel like when somebody else is grieving, we don't want to get too close because we don't want to say the wrong thing, or put salt in the wound or something. All these euphemisms that we use. What did the people around you do to encourage you through that time? What was most beneficial for you, and what were some of the things that we as people are trying to support one another can know? What are some things that can be helpful when we're trying to help somebody in their times of grief?
Well, I'll tell you, right the morning that Mark died, one of the things I remember almost the most, there was a lot going on. He was an unwitnessed death, so we had to wait for the police to come and the coroner and all of that. And family and friends showed up at our door, at our house, and a sister-in-law showed up that morning. And all she did, she went and cleaned my bathrooms, and she cleaned up my kitchen. And all she said to me was, "Janet, there's going to be a lot of people at your house today. You need clean bathrooms." And then another time, that was, Mark died in November, and so here it's Christmas. The last thing we were thinking about was a Christmas tree. Another friend came to the door. She had a Christmas tree. She had lights. She had all the ornaments. She just showed up. She said, "Janet, you need a Christmas tree." She wouldn't let me help her. That was the only year we ever had a designer Christmas tree. So I would say to people, if you're walking next to somebody in grief, don't wait for that person to ask for help. Wow. And it's the little things like cleaning a bathroom or bringing over a tree or something that means the world. And we had a Christmas because my friend Gail brought over a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
What a great point.
Yeah, that's a great experience. And we talk in our workshops about things not to say and things to say and do. So those are important, and I like that you cite those in your book as well.
And can I say one thing about that, too?
Sure.
Is I did notice that, especially with Mark, that was my little boy, people did not know what to say. They felt real uncomfortable. Right. And they would maybe mention his name or something, and then they would say, "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to upset you." It's like, hello, you cannot upset me by speaking his name.
Right.
You can't upset me anymore. But what I found, and maybe a lot of people do, you want to talk about them.
Right.
So if people would feel uncomfortable, then I would bring it up and I would say, I really miss Mark, and then that was kind of broke the ice.
It opened the conversation.
So that's another thing that just watch for that.
Yeah. And again, that doesn't have to be a death. It could be someone's divorce,
their
or
job.
They've lost their home, or just some kind of transition.
Right.
So, and speaking of transitions too, you cite, and I know I have gone through this and many people do, is that you come to an identity crisis when something big like this happens. And in counseling, I remember having several women, and one in particular, that her husband had died, and she was in her early 60s, and she was so grieved, not just from the grief, but from what everyone was telling her. And they were saying, all you have to do is reinvent yourself. And she was really distressed because she looked at me and said, "Do I really have to do that?" And I said, "No." Because what that makes us think is that we can't be ourselves. And so that made her put the inner tube on. It's just she would be closed off. And so when you went through this and you were a mother, a wife, and then you're saying, "Hello, nobody," how did you rally around yourself and your identity? How did you bring yourself to yourself?
That is a tough one because I lost my identity as a wife, as a couple, as being a mom. I still have a daughter, but she's moved on with her life, so I don't have any children to take care of, and so that mothering role is gone for me. It's really hard, and that because that is who I was in my mind, I was a wife and a mom. and I
course.
liked being a wife and a mom, and I was good at it. And so this reinventing of yourself really is just being willing to get up every morning. I think the reinventing of yourself starts every morning. You wake up, and it's a new day, and doors will open, events will occur. I think you just have to keep going forward, and that's really the hard part.
Yeah, it's a process.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
you mentioned this, that, and I love this in your book, where you say that God fit you with new shoes. And I liked it because it was a realistic view of the rocky road, that maybe we all start out with flip-flops, and then we're going to have to need those steel-toed boots, perhaps.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so that you were fitted. That's a great visual for people. So there was one more quote that we all know Jim Morrison from The Doors, and this is a terrific. Do you know Jim?
I do. I actually
You're giving me a
Jim
weird
Morrison
look here. So, yeah, we love The Doors. I love The Doors. People are strange. Dave is strange. But anyway, this is a quote from The Doors, and it says, "There are things known and there are things unknown, and in between are the doors." Isn't that awesome? And so I loved it, and I do love The Doors. But we're going to discuss the doors, Janet, in our next segment, and how you walked through those doors. And so we'll be right back. You're listening to Inspired Conversations on 55 KRC. We are back, and we're going to begin this segment with a story of a dying woman who wrote a letter, and I think it was in the New York Times. I don't know if you guys read this, but it was really remarkable. She was a children's book author, and she had some type of illness, and she knew she was dying, and she wrote the letter, and it was titled, "You May Want to Marry My Husband." And she wrote this long letter about all of his attributes and what a wonderful man he was. And I love it because we just talked about Jim Morrison and open doors, and I want to hear how Janet walked through some doors. But this gal actually opened the door for her husband and to move on with his life. And a lot of times I think that we're afraid to move on. But when we're married, we don't feel released to move on. And so she did him a great service, and this is about a year and a half ago that she wrote this, and she did die, and he is not married yet, but but he's healing, because like you said, Janet, grief is long and sometimes brutal, and but what a great send-off she had for him. So as you were opening new doors in your life, you say you were getting up, and you were trying new things, perhaps, or having new thoughts of what might be possible. How did you visualize new things for your life?
Again, that's a hard one. One event, it took me a long time to take off my wedding band. I wore my little wedding band for a couple of years. I know that I've talked to other women who have lost husbands, and they don't like to see it on their hand. They take it off right away. But for me, my wedding band, I wore it for maybe 3 years until, and that was a comfort to me. I just felt like it wasn't ready to take it off. It seems like a silly thing, but one day I looked at my finger and I thought to myself, that is a lie, Janet. That ring doesn't symbolize commitment or marriage or anything to you anymore. It's time to take it off. And so I did. I took it off, and I didn't wear it anymore. To me, that was a door. That was like a turning point. It sounds silly. It was such a small thing.
No, it's huge.
But to me, that was like, okay, took a while, but I was ready to lay that down.
Sure.
And what that meant to me.
And, I find, if we look at our piano keyboard, when people get stuck, a lot of people, whether it's in depression or anger, they want their old life back. Of course we do. And they say, whether it's they just are still grieving a spouse or a job or a home or whatever it is, and they say, I want my old life back. And so it's really easy for us to look backward.
Yeah, I think it's a natural tendency. And again, it's something that we see a lot in the Bible when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt and going into the Promised Land. when stuff got hard for them, they kept saying, well, it'd be better if we went back to Egypt. Wouldn't things be better if we went back? And yet God is always continuing to challenge us to move forward. And the analogy of the shoes and the type of shoes God gave you, those later chapters in the book where you talk about starting to walk up the steep hills, you make a comment in the book that says that the grief and the change forced you into making choices. How did this force you into choices, and how did you make those choices?
Wow. The choices you have to decide to keep going up that hill. And you refer to the flip-flop. I know I felt like, when I was a wife and a mom and everything was great, the analogy to me was like, I'm walking around in my life in flip-flops and they're comfortable and easy and casual. But then as things started getting harder and harder, the mountain was getting steeper and steeper. And the thing is, God will equip you. He won't make you climb up the mountain with the rocky path and the slipping stones in your flip-flops. He will equip you in your heart, in your confidence, in being brave to keep going up that mountain. And sometimes you don't even know that your shoes have changed. All of a sudden you look down and you say, wow, I stepped in that big rock and that didn't hurt because now I have my hiking boots on.
Yeah. And that's great growth.
Analogy.
Yes,
just
absolutely.
Saying. But God will do that to you. And I think all you have to do, is just really ask him. And when we were talking about faith before, faith can be real. It's not just something in church. And when I was 16 is when I all of a sudden realized that I needed to get to know God myself. And I needed to know him for me. And so I invited him into my life and my heart. And that's the framework also that helps you make these choices, because you realize I'm climbing up this hill, but I'm not climbing up by myself.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I'm climbing up this hill, but I'm going. I'm going to do it. And he'll open doors, he'll close doors, but the main thing to remember is that he'll equip you.
And so when you walked through the taking the wedding band off door, it led your mind to think of new things, and you're doing some new things now with your life. When I read on your card that you're doing some kind of writing, facilitating, can you tell us about that?
Sure. I owned a yarn shop for 13 years, and all of a sudden I just had a stirring in my heart that it was time. That it had served its purpose for me. It was that place, that was my community, but now I was being led somewhere else, called out to do something else. And I quickly sold my shop, and as soon as I sold it, a new thing just happened, some opportunities to teach writing workshops and journaling workshops. And I feel like, God doesn't waste a thing. And so he will use your past as preparation for what he has next for you. And for me, writing and talking to people and coming alongside people who are grieving, because I know what it's like. I have a lot of buckets of grief that I can speak to: retirement, empty nest, cancer, death of a child, death of a husband. All of those buckets I understand because they're in my life. And so God is using those, I think, for me now. I don't know where it's going to lead, but I'm just trying to be open, say, okay, I'll teach some classes. I'll help people write their story, because I'm really passionate that it's so important for us to tell our story. And like I said before, someone needs to hear it.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, so that's even, with our children's camp this last week, a great way for children to release those kind of grief feelings. There's so much that can be learned from what you're teaching.
But the thing that's really interesting is, and even in writing my book, you start writing and all of a sudden things are coming out of your heart and your mind, almost rushing out of you, that just need to be said. They're looking for a voice, and the voice is the writing. The voice is the words. And you don't even have to be a great writer, but if you just put your pen to the paper, it's so releasing and helpful to just start writing things down. And Dave, when you said you were writing to your sons, how precious is that? What a treasure that is for them, even now, but also a treasure for you to have those words that you can give them as you were traveling through your struggle.
Yeah, I think you're right. If you had to say, we never know who's listening to these shows, but knowing full well that among the crowd of folks who are listening, there are people who are in various stages of grief. What would you say to folks? I mean, if you had to boil it all down to something, what would it be that you would want people to carry away from this?
I would say live long enough and you will find grief. It will find you. It will happen. It's part of life. It happens to all of us. It's almost like the universal thing as being human that we have in common is that our lives will end, and we'd never want to think about that, but also that life isn't easy. And I think the one thing that I would like to have people just chew on and keep in their heart is that God really is real, that He's the one that pulled me up, pulled me out, held my hand. I really think that the harder your struggle, He plows up in your heart a place where He can get closer to you, and you can have a closer relationship than if you didn't have that hard thing, because He sees our tears, and He really does. He will have arms tighter around the brokenhearted, and it really is true. And if you don't feel that, or if you don't know about that, I would just say ask Him and tell Him. He wants our honest heart. He wants our honest feelings, and that's what I'd like to leave with people, because that's really what helped me. Because the end of my book, it's hello nobody, standing at the door alone, what to do, and everything changes, but He'll make a new you.
You know what I like about, and I think I read this at the end of the book, you say, hello, somebody. And then I think you're referring to the new you.
The hello, someone new.
Yes, yeah.
Exactly.
And so that's a great way to end. And I want to ask, where can people get your book and your website?
Oh, thanks. My website is the letter J, Haney.com, and the book is on Amazon, and it's an ebook and also a paperback.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Janet, for being here tonight, and we will see you next time on Inspired Conversations. You're listening to 55 KRC.
You're a falling star, you're the getaway car, you're the line in the sand when I go too far, you're the swimming